Well, here I am. Same pipe. Chapter 3 of Parnassus on Wheels. Well, I thought, if I'm in for an adventure, I may as well be spry about it. Andrew will be home by 12:30, and I'm going to have to give him the slip. I'd better get a start. I suppose he'll think I'm crazy. He'll follow me, I guess. Well, he just shan't catch me. That's all. A kind of anger came over me to think that I'd been living on that farm for nearly 15 years. Yes, sir, ever since I was 25, and hardly ever been away except for that trip to Boston once a year to go shopping with Cousin Eddie. I'm a home-keeping soul, I guess, and I love my kitchen and my preserved cupboard and my linen closet as well as grandmother ever did. But something in that blue October air and that crazy little red-bearded man just tickled me. Look here, Mr. Parnassus, I said. I guess I'm a fat old fool, but I just believe I'll do that. You hitch up your horse and van, and I'll go pack some clothes and write you a check. It'll do Andrew all the good in the world to have me skip. I'll get a chance to read a few books, too. It'll be as good as going to college. And I untied my apron and ran for the house. The little man stood leaning against the corner of the van as if he was stupefied. I dare say he was. I ran into the house through the front door, and it struck me as comical to see a copy of one of Andrew's magazines lying on the living room table with "The Revolt of Womanhood" printed across it in red letters. Here goes for the revolt of Helen McGill, I thought. I sat down at Andrew's desk, pushed aside a pad of notes he had been jotting down about the magic of autumn, and scrawled a few lines. Dear Andrew, don't be thinking I'm crazy. I've gone off for an adventure. It just came over me that you've had all the adventures while I've been at home baking bread. Mrs. McNally will look after your meals, and one of her girls can come over to do the housework. So don't worry. I'm going off for a little while, a month maybe, to see some of the happiness and hayseed of yours. It's what the magazines call the revolt of womanhood. Warm underwear in the cedar chest in the spare room when you need it. With love, Helen. I left the note on his desk. Mrs. McNally was bending over the tubs in the laundry. I could see only the broad arch of her back and hear the vigorous zzz 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 of her rubbing. She straightened up at my call. Mrs. McNally, I said, I'm going away for a little trip. You better let the washing go until this afternoon and get Andrew's dinner for him. He'll be back about 12:30. It's 10:30 now. You tell him I've gone over to see Mrs. Collins at Locust Farm. Mrs. McNally is a brawny, slow-witted sweet. All right, Miss McGill, she said. You'll be back to dinner? No, I'm coming back for a month. I'm not coming back for a month, I said. I'm going away for a trip. I want you to send Rosie over here every day to do the housework while I'm away. You can arrange with Mr. McGill about that. I've got to hurry now. Mrs. McNally's honest eyes, as blue as Copenhagen china, gazing through the window in perplexity, fell upon the traveling Parnassus and Mr. Mifflin backing Pegasus into the shafts. I saw her make a valiant effort to comprehend the sign printed on the side of the van and give it up. You're going driving, she said blankly. Yes, I said, and fled upstairs. I always kept my bank book in an old Hoyer box in the top drawer of my bureau. I don't save very quickly, I'm afraid. I have a little income from some money Father left me, but Andrew takes care of that. Andrew pays all the farm expenses, but the housekeeping accounts fall to me. I make a fairish amount of pin money on my poultry, and some of my preserves that I send to Boston, and on some recipes of mine that I send to women's magazines now and then. But generally my savings don't amount to much over $10 a month. In the past 5 years, I had put something like more than $600. I had been saving up for a Ford, but just now it looked to me as if the Parnassus would be more fun than a Ford ever could be. $400 was a lot of money, but I thought of what it would mean to have Andrew come home and buy it. Why, he'd be away until Thanksgiving, whereas if I bought it, I could take it away, have my adventure, and sell it somewhere so that Andrew never needs see it. I hardened my heart and determined to give the sage of Redfield some of his own medicine. Time to work on the pipe. My balance at the Redfield National Bank was $615.20. I sat down at the table in my bedroom where I keep my accounts and wrote out a check to Roger Mifflin for $400. I put in plenty of curlicues after the figures so that no one could raise the check into $400,000. Then I got my old rattan suitcase and put in some clothes. The whole business didn't take me 10 minutes. I came downstairs to find Mrs. McNally looking sourly at the Parnassus from the kitchen door. "You going away in that bus, Miss McGill?" she asked. "Yes, Mrs. McNally," I said cheerfully. Her use of the word gave me an inspiration. "That's one of the new jitney buses we hear about. He's going to take me to the station. Don't you worry about it. I'm going for a holiday. You get Mr. McGill's dinner ready for him. After dinner, tell him there's a note for him in the living room." "I think that bane a queer bus," said Miss McNally, puzzled. I think the excellent woman suspected an elopement. I carried my suitcase out to the Parnassus. Pegasus stood placidly between the shafts. From within came sounds of vigorous movement. In a moment, the little man burst out with a bulging portmanteau in his hand. He had a tweed cap slanted on the back of his head. "There," he cried triumphantly. "I packed all my personal effects, clothes and so on, and everything else goes with the transaction. When I get on the train with the bag, I'm a free man, and hurrah for Brooklyn. Lord, won't I be glad to get back to the city. I lived in Brooklyn once, and I haven't been back there for 10 years, he added plaintively. "Here's the check," I said, handing it to him. He flushed a little, and he looked at me rather shamefacedly. "See here," he said, "I hope you're not making a bad bargain. I don't want to take advantage of the lady. If you think your brother—" "I was going to buy a Ford anyway," I said, "and it looks to me as though this Parcheesi of yours would be cheaper to run than any flivver that ever came out of Detroit. I want to keep it away from Andrew, and that's the main thing. You give me a receipt and we'll get away from here before he comes back." He took the check without a word, hoisted his fat portmanteau onto the driver's seat, and then disappeared in the van. In a minute he reappeared. On the back of one of his poetical cards he had written, "Received from Miss McGill the sum of $400 in exchange for one traveling Parnassus in first-class condition, delivered on this day, October 3rd, 19—" He left that part blank. "Signed Roger Mifflin." "Tell me," I said, "does my Parnassus, contain everything I'm likely to need? Is it stocked up with food and so on?" "I was coming to that," he said. "You'll find a fair supply of stuff in the cupboard over the stove, though I used to get most of my meals at farmhouses along the road. I generally read aloud to people as I go along, and they're often good for a free meal." It's amazing how little most of the country folk know about books and how pleased they are to hear good stuff down in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Well, how about the horse? I said hastily, seeing him about to embark on an antidote. It wasn't it wasn't far short of 11 o'clock, and I was anxious to get started. It might be well to take along some oats. My supply is almost exhausted. I filled a sack with oats in the stable, and Mr. Mifflin showed me where to hang it under the van. Then in the kitchen, I loaded a big basket with provisions for an emergency. A dozen eggs, a jar of sliced bacon, butter, cheese, condensed milk, tea, biscuits, jam, and 2 loaves of bread. These Mr. Mifflin stowed inside the van, Mrs. McNally watching in amazement. "I tank this being a queer picnic," she said. "Which way are you going? Mr. McGill, is he coming after you?" "No," I insisted. "He's not coming. I'm going off on a holiday. You get dinner for him, and he won't worry about anything until after that. Tell him I've gone over to see Mrs. Collins." I climbed the little steps and entered my Parnassus with a pleasant thrill of ownership. The terrier on the bunk jumped to the floor with a friendly wag of his tail. I piled the bunk with bedding and blankets of my own, shook out the drawers which fitted above the bunk, and put into them what few belongings I was taking with me, and we were ready to start. Redbeard was already sitting in front with the reins in hand. I climbed up beside him. The front seat was broad but uncushioned, well sheltered by the peak of the van. I gave a quick glance around at the comfortable house under its elms and maples, saw the big red barn shining in the sun, and pump under the grape arbor. I waved goodbye to Mrs. McNally, who was watching us in silent amazement. Pegasus threw her solid weight against the traces, and Parnassus swung round and rolled past the gate. We turned into the Redfield Road. "Here," said Mifflin, handing me the reins. "You're skipper. You better drive. Which way do you want to go?" My breath came a little fast when I realized that my adventure had begun. End of chapter 3. Time to tamp. Oh, this lighter ain't working. I gotta clean one. Grab this one. Chapter 4. Just out of the sight of the farm, the road forks, one way running onto Walton, where you cross the river by a covered bridge, the other swinging down toward Greenbrier and Port Vigor. Mrs. Collins lives a mile or so up the Walton Road, and as I very often run over to see her, I thought Andrew would be most likely to look for me there. So after we had passed through the grove, I took the right-hand turn to Greenbrier. We began the long ascent over Huckleberry Hill, and as I smelt the fresh autumn odor of the leaves, I chuckled a little. Mr. Mifflin seemed in a perfect ecstasy of high spirits. "This is certainly grand," he said. "Lord, I applaud your spunk. Do you think Mr. McGill will give chase?" "I haven't an idea," I said. "Not right away, anyhow. He's so used to my settled ways that I don't think he'll suspect anything until he finds my note. I wonder what kind of story Miss McNally will tell." "How about putting him off the scent?" he said. "Give me your handkerchief." I did so. He hopped nimbly out, ran back down the hill — he was a spry little person in spite of his bald crown — and dropped the handkerchief on the Walton Road about 100 feet beyond the fork. Then he followed me up the slope. "There," he said, grinning like a kid. "That'll fool him. The sage of Redfield will undoubtedly follow a false spoor, and the criminals will win a good start. but I'm afraid it's rather easy to follow a craft as unusual as Parnassus. Tell me how you manage the thing, I said. Do you really make it pay? We halted at the top of the hill to give Pegasus a breathing space. The terrier lay down in the dust and watched us gravely. Mr. Mifflin pulled out a pipe and begged my permission to smoke. It's rather comical how I first got into it, he said. I was a school teacher down in Maryland. I'd been plugging away in a country school for years on a starvation salary. I was trying to support an invalid mother and put by something in case of storms. I remember how I used to wonder whether I'd be able to wear a suit that wasn't shabby and have my shoes polished every day. Then my health went back on me. The doctor told me to get into the open air. By and by, I got this idea of a traveling bookstore. I had always been a lover of books, and in the days when I boarded out among the farmers, I used to read aloud to them. After my mother died, I built the wagon to suit my own ideas, bought a stock of books from a big secondhand store in Baltimore, and set out. Parnassus just about saved my life, I guess. He pushed his faded old cap back on his head and relit his pipe. I clicked to Pegasus, and we rumbled gently over the upland, looking down across the pastures. Distant cowbells sounded tinkle-tonk among the bushes. Across the slope of the hill, I could see the road winding away to Redfield. Somewhere along that road, Andrew would be rolling back toward home and roast pork with applesauce, and here was I, setting out on the first madness of my life without even a qualm. Gotta relight again, guys. Miss McGill, said the little man, this rolling pavilion has been wife, doctor, and religion to me for 7 years. A month ago I would have scoffed at the thought of leaving her. But somehow it's come over me I need a change. There's a book I've been yearning to write for a long time, and I need a desk steady under my elbows and a roof over my head. And silly as it seems, I'm crazy to get back to Brooklyn. My brother and I used to live there as kids. Think of walking over the old bridge at sunset, seeing the towers of Manhattan against a red sky, and those old gray cruisers down in the Navy Yard. You don't know how tickled I am to sell out. I've sold a lot of copies of your brother's books, and I've often thought he'd be the man to buy Parnassus if I got tired of her. So he would, I said. Just the man. He'd be only too likely to, and go wandering about in this jaunting car and neglect the farm. But tell me about selling books. How much profit do you make out of it? We'll be passing Mrs. Mason's farm by and by, and we might as well sell her something just to make a start. It's very simple, he said. I replenish my stock whenever I go through a big town. There's always a second-hand bookstore somewhere about where you can pick up odds and ends. And every now and then I write a wholesaler in New York for some stuff. When I buy a book, I mark in the back just what I paid for it. Then I know what I can afford to sell it for. See here? He pulled up a book from behind the seat. A copy of Lorna Doone. It was, and showed me a copy of Lorna Doone it was, and showed me the letters A.M. scrawled in pencil in the back. That means I paid 10 cents for this. Now if you sell it for a quarter, you got a safe profit. It cost me about $4 a week to run Parnassus, generally less. If you clear that much in 6 days, you can afford to lay off on Sundays. How do you know what AM stands for? How do you know that AM stands for 10 cents? I asked. The code word's manuscript. Each letter stands for a figure from 0 to 9. See? He scrawled it down on a scrap of paper. Manuscript 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now you see AM stands for 10. AN would be 12. NS is 24. AC is 15. AMM is $1. So on. I don't pay much over 50 cents for a book as a rule because country folks are shy of paying much for them. They'll pay a lot for a separator or a buggy top, but they've never been taught to worry about literature. But it's surprising how excited they get about books if you sell them the right kind. Over beyond Port Vigor, there's a farmer who's waiting for me to go back. I've been there 3 or 4 times, and he'll buy about $5 worth if I know him. First time I went there, I sold him Treasure Island, and he's talking about it yet. I sold him Robinson Crusoe and Little Women for his daughter, and Huck Finn, and Grubb's book about the potato. Last time I was there, he wanted some Shakespeare, but I wouldn't give it to him. I didn't think he was up to it yet. I began to see something of the little man's idealism in his work. He was kind of a traveling missionary in his way, a hefty talker, too. His eyes were twinkling now. I could see him warming up. Lord, he said, when you sell a man a book, you don't sell him just 12 ounces of paper and ink and glue. You sell him a whole new life. Love and friendship and humor and ships at sea by night. There's all heaven and earth in a book, a real book, I mean, Jiminy. If I were the baker or the butcher or the broom huckster, people would run to the gate when I came by, just waiting for my stuff. And here I go loaded with everlasting salvation. Yes, ma'am, salvation for their little stunted minds. And it's hard to make them see it. That's what makes it worthwhile. I'm doing something that nobody else from Nazareth, Maine, to Walla Walla, Washington has ever thought of. It's a new field. But by the bones of Whitman, it's worthwhile. That's what this country needs, more books. Got to relight again. Sorry. He laughed at his own vehemence. Do you know it's comical, he said. Even the publishers, the fellows that print the books, can't see what I'm doing for them. Some of them refuse me credit because I sell their books for what they're worth instead of for the prices they mark on them. They write me letters about price maintenance, and I write back about merit maintenance. Publish a good book and I'll get a good price for it, I say. Sometimes I think the publishers know less about books than anyone else. I guess that's natural, though. Most school teachers don't know much about children. The best of it is, he went on, I have such a darn good time. Peg and Buck, that's the dog, and I go loafing along the road on a warm summer day, and by we'll fetch up alongside some boarding house, and there are the boarders all rocking off their lunch on the veranda. Most of them bored to death. Nothing good to read, nothing to do but sit and watch the flies buzzing in the sun, and the chickens rubbing up and down in the dust. First thing you know, I'll sell a half-dozen books that put the love of life into them, and they don't forget Parnassus in a hurry. Take O. Henry, for instance. There isn't anybody so doggone sleepy that he won't enjoy that man's stories. He understood life, you bet, and he could write it down with all its little twists. I spent an evening reading O. Henry and Willie Collins to people, and had them buy all of the books I had and clamored for more. What do you do in the winter? I asked a practical question, as most of mine are. That depends on where I am when bad weather sets in, said Mr. Mifflin. 2 winters I was down south and managed to keep Parnassus going all through the season. Otherwise, I just lay up wherever I am. I've never found it hard to get lodging for Peg and a job for myself if I have to have them. Last winter, I worked in a bookstore in Boston. Winter before, I was in a country drugstore down in Pennsylvania. Winter before that, I tutored a couple of small boys in English literature. Winter before that, I was a steward on a steamer, and you see how it goes. I've had a fairly miscellaneous experience. As far as I can see, a man who's fond of books never need starve. But this winter, I'm planning to live with my brother in Brooklyn and slog away at my book. Lord, how I've pondered over the thing. Long summer afternoons I've sat here jogging along in the dust, thinking it out, until it seemed as if my forehead would burst. You see, my idea is that the common people, in the country that is, never have had any chance to get hold of books, never have had anyone to explain what books can mean. It's all right for college presidents to draw up their 5-foot shelves of great literature, and for the publishers to advertise sets of their linoleum classics. But what the people need in the good, homely, honest stuff. Something that'll stick to their ribs, make them laugh without ever even getting a hot box. Oh, wait. Make them laugh and tremble and feel sick to think of the littleness of this popcorn ball spinning in space without ever getting a hot box. And something that'll spur them on to keep the hearth well swept and the woodpile split into kindling and the dishes washed and dried and put away. Anyone who can get the country people to read something worthwhile is doing his nation a real service. And that's what this caravan of culture aspires to. You must be weary by this harangue. Does the sage of Redfield ever run on like that? Not to me, I said. He's known me so long that he thinks of me as a kind of animated bread baking and cake making machine. I guess he doesn't put much stock in my judgment in literary matters, but he puts his digestion in my hands without reserve. There's Mason's farm over there. I guess we'd better sell them some books, hadn't we? Just for a starter. We turned into the lane that runs up to the Mason farmhouse. Bach trotted on ahead, very stiff on his legs, and tail gently wagging to interview the mastiff, and Mrs. Mason, who was sitting on the porch peeling potatoes, laid down the pan. She's a big, buxom woman with jolly brown eyes like a cow. For heaven's sake, Miss McGill, she called out in a cheerful voice, I'm glad to see you. Got a lift, did you? She hadn't really noticed the inscription on Parnassus and thought it was a regular huckster's wagon. Well, Mrs. Mason, I said, I've gone into the book business. This is Mr. Mifflin. I've bought out his stock. We've come to sell you some books. She laughed. Go on, Helen, she said. You can't kid me. I bought a whole set of books last year from an agent. The world's greatest funeral orations, 20 volumes. Sam and I ain't read more in the first volume yet. It's awful uneasy reading. Mifflin jumped down, raised the side flap of the wagon. Mrs. Mason came closer. I was tickled to see how the little man perked up at the sight of a customer. Evidently selling books was the meat and drink to him. Madam, he said, funeral orations, bound in sackcloth, I suppose, have their place, but Miss McGill and I have got some real books here, to which I invite your attention. Winter will be here soon, and you will need something more cheerful to beguile your evenings. Very possibly you have growing children who would profit by a good book or two. A book of fairy tales for the little girl I see on the porch? Or stories of inventors for that boy who is about to break his neck jumping from the barn loft? Or a book about road making for your husband? Surely there is something here for you. Something here you need. Miss McGill probably knows your tastes. That little red-bearded man was surely a born salesman. How he guessed that Mr. Mason was the road commissioner in a township, goodness only knows. Perhaps it was just a lucky shot. By this time, most of the family had gathered around the van, and I saw Mr. Mason coming from the barn with his 12-year-old Billy. Sam, shouted Mrs. Mason, here's Miss McGill. Turned book peddler and got a preacher with her. Hello, Miss McGill, said Mr. Mason. He is a big, slow-moving man of great gravity and solidity. Where's Andrew? Andrew's coming home for roast pork and applesauce, I said. I'm going off to sell books for a living. Mr. Mifflin is teaching me how. We've got a book on road mending that's just what you need. I saw Mr. and Mrs. Mason exchange glances. Evidently, they thought me crazy. I began to wonder whether we had made a mistake in calling on people I knew so well. The situation was a trifling embarrassing. Let me relight. This chapter 4 seems a bit long, so... Mr. Mifflin came to the rescue. Don't be alarmed, sir, he said to Mr. Mason. I haven't kidnapped Miss McGill. As he is about half my size, this was amusing. We are trying to increase her brother's income by selling his books for him. As a matter of fact, we have a wager with him that we can sell 50 copies of Happiness and Hayseed before Halloween. Now I'm sure your sporting instinct will assist us by taking at least one copy. Andrew McGill is probably the greatest author in this state, and every taxpayer ought to possess his books. May I show you a copy? That sounds reasonable, said Mr. Mason, and he almost smiled. What do you say, Emma? Think we better buy a book or two? You know those funeral orations. Well, said Emma, you know, we've always said we ought to read one of Andrew McGill's books, but we didn't rightly know how to get hold of one. That fellow that sold us the funeral speeches didn't seem to know about 'em. I'll tell you what, you folks better stop and have dinner with us, and you can tell us what we ought to buy. I'm just ready to put the potatoes on the stove now. I must confess that the prospect of sitting down to a meal I hadn't cooked myself appealed to me strongly, and I was keen to see what kind of grub Mrs. Mason provided for her household. But I was afraid that if we dallied there too long, Andrew would be after us. I was about to say that we would have to be getting on and couldn't stay, but apparently the zest of expounding his philosophy to new listeners was too much for Mifflin. I heard him saying, "That's mighty kind of you, Mrs. Mason. We'd be very happy. We'd like very much to stay. Perhaps I can put Peg up in your barn for a while. Then we can tell you all about our books." And to my amazement, I found myself chiming in with assent. Okay. Mifflin certainly surpassed himself at dinner. The fact that Mrs. Mason's hot biscuits tasted of salutis gave me far less satisfaction than it otherwise would, because I was absorbed in listening to the little vagabonds talk. Mr. Mason came to the table grumbling something about his telephone being out of order. I wonder whether he had been trying to get Andrew on the wire. He was a little afraid that I was being run away with, I think. But he was soon won over by the current of the little man's cheery wit. Nothing daunted Mifflin. He talked to the old grandmother about quilts, offered to cut off a strap of his necktie for her new patchwork, and told all about the illustrated book on quilts that he had in the van. He discussed cookery and the Bible with Mrs. Mason, and she, being a leading light in the Greenbrier Sunday School, was pleasantly scandalized by his account of the best detective stories in the Old Testament. With Mr. Mason, he was all scientific farming, chemical manures, macadam roads, and crop rotation. And to little Billy, who sat next to him, he told extraordinary yarns about Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill, and whatnot. Honestly, I was amazed at the little man. He was as genial as a cricket on the hearth, and yet every now and then his earnestness would break through. I don't wonder if he was a success at selling books. That man could sell clothespins or Paris garters, I guess, and make them seem romantic. You know, Mr. Mason, he said, you certainly owe it to these youngsters of yours to put a few really good books into their hands. City kids have the libraries to go to, but in the country there's only old Doc Hostetter's Almanac and the letters written by ladies with backache telling how Peruna did for them. Give this boy and girl of yours a few good books, and you're starting them on the double track. Block signal line to happiness. Now there's Little Women. That girl of yours can learn more about real girlhood and fine womanhood out of that book, than from a year's paper dolls in the attic. That's right, Pa, assented Mrs. Mason. Go on with your meal, Professor. The meat'll be cold. She was completely won by the traveling bookseller and had given him the highest title of honor in her ken. Why, I read that story when I was a little girl, and I still remember it. That's better reading for Dorothy than those funeral speeches, I reckon. I believe the professor's right. We ought to have more books laying around. Seems kind of a shame with a famous author at the next farm not to read more. Don't it now? So by the time we got down to Mrs. Mason's squash pie, good pie too, I admit, but her hand is a little heavy for pastry, the whole household was enthusiastic about books. The atmosphere was literary enough for even Dr. Eliot to live in without panting. Mrs. Mason opened up her parlor, and we sat there while Mifflin recited The Revenge and Maud Muller. Well now, ain't that real sweet, said Emma Mason. It's surprising how those words rhyme so nicely. Seems almost as though it was done a purpose. Reminds me of a piece day at school. There was a mighty pretty piece I learned called The Wreck of the Asperus, and she subsided into genteel melancholy. I saw that Mr. Mifflin was well astride his hobby. He had started to tell the children about Robin Hood, but I had the sense to give him a wink. We had to be getting along, or surely Andrew might be on us. So while Mifflin was putting Pegasus into the shafts again, I picked out 7 or 8 books that I thought would fit the needs of the Masons. Mr. Mason insisted that Happiness and Hayseed be included among them, and gave me a crisp $5 bill, refusing any change. No, he said. I've had more fun than I get at a Grange meeting. Come round again, Miss McGill. I'm going to tell Andrew what a good show this traveling theater of yours gives. And you, Professor, any time you're here about road mending season, stop in and tell me some more good advice. Well, I must get back to the field. Bach fell in under the van, and we creaked off down the lane. Mifflin filled his pipe and was chuckling to himself. I was a little worried now for fear Andrew might overtake us. It's a wonder Sam Mason didn't call up Andrew, I said. It must have looked mighty queer for him, for an old farmhand like me to be around peddling books. He would have done it straight off, said Mifflin, but you see, I cut his telephone wire. End of chapter 4. Okay, guys. I'll be back again later.